just the basic methodology of medicine. If somebody comes to see you, and I'm talking about in general, you're going to sit down, you
Yeah.
say, "Hey, Dr. Clint, tell me what brings you in. I understand you're having a lot of headaches, for example." "Oh, yeah. Well, when did they start?" "Well, they started 2 years ago. I had an accident, had it cracked my head pretty hard, concussion ever since that." What we call the history of present illness, right? Standard
Yep.
medicine 101. So that's still important. My belief is sort of like quantum, physics or quantum reality. Like we have to know the disease, but we have to know the person who has the disease. So I still get that kind of medical history.
Welcome to My MD Unscripted, where healthcare gets personal and the script gets tossed. I'm Dr. Clint Carter, ER doctor turned direct primary care freedom fighter, on a mission to challenge how our healthcare system treats patients in America. In every episode, my expert guests and I dive into real conversations about what's broken and how we can fix it by making healthcare about people, not just managing disease. It's time to rethink what healthcare should be and how we can make it better together. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello, and welcome back to the My MD Unscripted podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Clint Carter, and I am truly honored today to be joined by Dr. Ken Sharlin. He's a neurologist, functional medicine practitioner. He does research. He's an author of a #1 bestseller book called The Healthy Brain Toolbox. He's trained everywhere that's good, from Emory to UVA to Vanderbilt, and then eventually, of course, IFM for functional medicine. So this is really an honor. This is going to be fun. Sort of the opening question that makes the most sense for us to get started with is, what if Alzheimer's isn't really just a one-way dead-end street that you can't do anything about, but really more of a systemic problem that we've mislabeled all along? And I can't wait to dig into this with you, Ken. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate being here.
Well, so I don't know if that introduction does you justice. What sort of pushed you from, the classic neurology track into the functional medicine track?
It's probably kind of similar to your situation and many other providers, just in a slightly different flavor, meaning, as you know, we have a lot of burnout right now in medicine. A lot of doctors very unhappy with the system, very unhappy with the whole third-party payer, very unhappy with the entire model. And likewise, of course, we have, I always say, look, I'm a patient too, right? So
Yeah.
just because I'm a doctor, I mean, I, don't need a doctor occasionally. But my point is that even from the patient care side, there's a tremendous amount of dissatisfaction. And, I know that many people have arrived to the space we call functional and even regenerative medicine from the point of view of a health crisis. I'm fortunately blessed that I never had that health crisis. It was just tremendous dissatisfaction with what I'm doing that just didn't align with why I chose to go into medicine in the first place. But for me as well, just to make a long story short, I had gotten interested in endurance sports back around 2006, 2007, eventually getting involved specifically in the sport of triathlon and finishing a few Ironman triathlons. But the real thing here is that in doing this, these feats, these physical feats, if you will, 140.6 miles in a day, swim, bike, run.
Yeah.
Well, you don't just get up one day and do it, right? And
Yeah.
even to say you have a training plan, right? A workout, whatever, that's not enough, because in order to execute, you have to have your sleep dialed in. You have to have your nutrition dialed in the whole time, but also, of course, on race day, the whole time. You
Yeah.
have to be able to evaluate your body's stress response system, because there's something called overtraining, and you can actually
Yeah.
really
Oh,
break
yeah.
down from that. So I was, for lack of a better term, sort of geeking out on all this stuff and learning the science, and it's just the way I think, and not just following a formula, and realizing that I was making all these changes and thinking, my goodness, this really follows the principles of what I should be doing in my office as well. I didn't have a name for it at that point in time, but I felt like
Mm.
that should be in my toolbox, not getting everyone, of course, to do an Ironman triathlon, but thinking like sleep makes a difference, food makes a difference. And lo and behold, it was about the time that Dave Perlmutter published his book, Grain Brain, which sort of put him on the map. And
Yeah.
I read it and I heard him interviewed in podcast. And it just changed my world. I thought, this is exactly what I've been looking for. And I was ready to quit. I was ready to hang it up as a doctor. But fortunately, I found out about IFM. My wife encouraged me, just go, whatever their next conference is. It doesn't really matter. And it was one of their more advanced modules. It was a hormone module. I went and it was transformative. And I, checked that box for hormones, but I went and did all of their courses, their foundational course called AFMCP, Applying Functional Medicine Clinical Practice, and went on, finished all the modules and connected with the right people. That was important to me. David Perlmutter, Terry Walls, Dale Bredesen, the people who were working in my space, looking at it
Yeah.
from a different perspective than here's your diagnosis, here's the pill, right?
Yeah. Oh, well, it's quite a list. And I would put, to that point, I'd put you on that list with them. And from my getting into the game after you did, and really, I'm thankful for what you're doing in the space and how you take care of your patients. And, the contrast is really with, when in my area, it's 9 to 12 months wait to get in with a neurologist. And you get this, you get this diagnosis. It's scary. It sounds like, like I said, a one-way dead end street to nowhereville and misery. And I'm like, well, there's just not that many neurologists because it's a diagnostic field in which there aren't a lot of treatments that actually make a difference in people's lives. Like you can diagnose way more than you can fix. And it's a hard specialty and blah, 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 blah. And ultimately we have a really good medical community for, a 150,000 person town or whatever, but neurology is not our strong suit. And, the stance on it when they finally do get in to see them is like, well, okay, you're sort of, there's some medicines that can push your symptoms back or minimize them for a while, but this train, it doesn't stop. And so it's this irreversible, progressive, description of their condition. And I guess, it's hard to blame them because they don't know what you know. They don't do what y'all do in this space. But do you feel like, as we get into your slightly different approach, do you feel like mainstream neurology is making any moves in that direction?
Oh, definitely. A lot has changed over the years. I actually had lunch with a gentleman who's been in the MS space for a long time and, affiliated with one of the pharmaceutical companies. And I do work with meds, right? And where appropriate,
Yeah.
about half of my MS patients take medication, about half don't. But the point is that, he's old enough. He said, he he was involved with really one of the earlier sort of really breakthrough drugs that changed the face of MS, and it's called Gileni or fingolimod. And he said, when I started working that space and I'd see people with MS, everybody's in walkers, wheelchairs, etc. And things have changed so much in the MS space. And now, it's kind of like, I don't want to say that, I don't want to, when I say this, I don't want anybody to think I'm just drawing an analogy that, things have changed a lot in the world of AIDS and HIV. When I was in training, I mean, HIV is just terrible. AIDS is terrible. But, now you can be on medication and CD4 counts normal and viral load is 0 and people live with the virus, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's not a cure, but they have their lives. And it's very similar with MS where, yes, of course, there are folks who are very disabled by MS, but we know that early intervention with high efficacy therapy can offer the hope that really, sort of like I have MS, but MS doesn't have me. So there are areas, we have a lot of drugs that treat Parkinson's disease. Unfortunately, none of them are definitively what I call disease modifying. So they're
Yeah.
all of them revolve around pretty much, not all of them, but most of them revolve around, somehow stimulating dopamine in the brain.
Yeah.
There are
Yeah.
a few exceptions. Alzheimer's disease, well, we have 2 approved drugs that They're not great by any means, but do they slow disease progression a little bit? Yes. Do they restore memory? No. But, a lot of strides are being made. There's a lot of research. It's a big growth area. So I don't want to say, things are stagnant, but I would say that I believe either consciously or unconsciously, we've created a sort of working myth. And that is, first of all, you name the disease, right? Got to name the
Yeah.
disease, because if you don't name the disease, then you don't have the pill or the drug to assign to the disease. And then, in contrast to where we actually are with the technology, we're really not practicing personalized precision medicine. And that kind of goes back to
Yeah.
your original point in the introduction. Like, not all people with Alzheimer's are the same. Not all people with MS are the same. If we have 27 or 28 different drugs to treat MS that fall into some different categories in terms of mechanism of action, we should be thinking about, if a drug is appropriate, what drug is appropriate for you and your MS, and not because it's a pill or an IV or a subcutaneous injection where people are thinking about what's more convenient. And I get that, but actually understand genetically, biochemically, physiologically, right? What is the best match? We do this for cancer, right? We get a biopsy,
Yeah.
we characterize tissue, we look at all the tissue markers, and then the actual treatment for the cancer is individualized. But we aren't doing it in the neurology space. And it's a big, big mistake that has led to a lot of suffering.
Yeah. The insurance based system for a long time, its built in flaw is, from my perspective, because that's what I do. I'm outside that space. And, obviously you are too now, largely, is that, it treats the fruit, right? You name the disease, you treat the disease. For the most part, it's all based on giant randomized controlled trials, which are informative and helpful, but they are assuming that your patient or you are somehow an average, an amalgam, some combination of that 50,000 people, 10,000 people, 5,000 people, whatever. And it misses the opportunity to personalize it and things in so many ways that are much simpler than, say, neurodegenerative conditions that are super hard and complicated, and we don't have that many resources for. But on the simple stuff, I have, I'm the medical director at my place, and I've got folks that are pretty stringently stuck. Some of my providers love the guidelines, and I'm like, okay, I guess. I mean, the guidelines, there's value there. They're not useless. They were established by someone who was making money on the outcomes, I'm sure, but we'll take that, you know, with a grain of salt. It's not personalized, and I got patients that aren't going to fit in that box, and they certainly don't want to fit in that box. So I love the way that you're describing, cancer and some of the other things that are getting more personalized, to the point that now you really should be doing genetic testing as you do biopsy, path and all the things with cancer as well. But so once we're naming the problem, right, and to keep from getting in that box, the beauty of functional medicine is root cause, right? So
Right.
how do you look at these conditions, when someone comes in, when you start getting personal, you want to personalize it? How so? Where do you start?
Yeah, I think it's essentially a two-pronged approach. There's, just the basic methodology of medicine. If somebody comes to see you, and I'm talking about in general, you're going to sit down, you
Yeah.
say, "Hey, Dr. Clint, tell me what brings you in. I understand you're having a lot of headaches, for example." "Oh, yeah. Well, when did they start?" "Well, they started 2 years ago. I had an accident, had to crack my head pretty hard, concussion ever since that." What we call the history of present illness, right? Standard
Yep.
medicine 101. So that's still important. My belief is sort of like quantum, physics or quantum reality. Like, we have to know the disease, but we have to know the person who has the disease. So I still get that kind of medical history. But then, functional medicine, at least through IFM, teaches something called a timeline, which says, okay, well, tell me a little bit about where were you born, and, are your parents still alive? And yeah, no, they passed. Well, tell me about your dad. I usually start with dad because mom plays such a huge role. I want to get dad out of the way a little bit. But anyway, I asked about dad. How is his health? What did he do for a living? What was your relationship with, your parents like? What was your household like? And then mother, similar kinds of questions. And then we get into pregnancy history, birth history. Were you born by, traditionally by a vaginal delivery or cesarean section? Because we know that impacts a person's future health. Were you breastfed or bottle fed? Tell me about your early childhood. Tell me about your grade school years. We just go through this. Were you ever sick? Were you ever treated with antibiotics? You ever have any head injuries? You have any environmental exposures? We just work through that all the way up into the present day. And what that tells us in the language of functional medicine is we organize the information into what is called the antecedents, kind of the things that the family, when we say the family history of things that you just kind of, they came into the world with you, and then triggers. And then finally, when we reach that tipping point where the illness itself, the focus of why you came to see me becomes apparent, what are the mediators? What are the things that are keeping you on that trajectory? And then I'll take a lifestyle medicine history. I want to know about your sleep. I want to know about your food. I want to know about your movement. I want to know, about your stress. And I ask that in different ways. Like I tell people, think of a car that has an idling speed. What's your idling speed when it comes to stress? What do you do to relax, to unwind? Do you have any formal practices? I ask them about the relationships. Of course, I ask about environmental exposures and, do they have any concerns if they're men, that their testosterone may be low? If they're women, are they postmenopausal? So I get all of that and we organize that to really start to understand the unique nature of that person. Where are their strengths? Where are their weaknesses? What do we need to work on? And then we add to that a very deep dive into labs that helps me understand really at the cellular and subcellular level what's going on biochemically, genetically, looking at drivers of inflammation, oxidative stress, and so forth, the things that are critical to understanding neurological disease. I have my own sort of proprietary panel that I've developed and I've used it for
Okay.
years. And we start to put it all together and we say, okay, this is the big picture. This is what we need to be working on.
Man, that's a loaded question. Then where do you start? I mean, all of it, everything.
Everything. You can't ignore
Birth
it. You can't.
to lab.
Well, we'll just start with the gut. Okay, start with the gut. Yeah, but don't move or don't care about your sleep. No, we kind of have to
Right.
hit all the things. But
Yep.
obviously, we're going to give emphasis to the areas where the person needs the most help. And I use a team-based
Right.
approach. So I have a dietitian. I have a health coach. We have somebody that does what I call neurofitness. And we start to change a few habits. We correct the imbalances. We'll use drugs if drugs need to be used, right? Again, it's personalized precision medicine.
Yeah.
But to ignore those lifestyle factors, to say, well, how many people, and I'm sure you see them as well. There are a few people say, I admit my diet's not very good. But,
Yeah.
on the other hand, most people say, I think I eat pretty healthy. I still go to McDonald's a few times a month, but I eat pretty like that doesn't tell me
Right.
anything, right?
Yep.
You have to take a detailed nutrition history and look at their nutrient levels, calculate their macros, really take a deep dive into nutrition and fix the things that need to be fixed.
And you're getting into inflammation, such a buzzword really in health these days. But in your world, like neuroinflammation is,
It's real.
it's yeah, and it's a downstream effect of the other inflammation a lot of the time. You're having to look. You got someone comes in, you're a specialist. They're coming in with a specialist level problem, and you're starting at the basics to just you got to figure out where the fires are, so you can if you need to help with the gut, you help with the gut, the diet, the exercise, the sleep, the stress. God, that makes perfect sense. Okay, and then so you start putting the puzzle together. I don't know. Alzheimer's is such a buzzword. Not really buzzword. It's on everyone's mind because our parents, in my case, my grandparents are just, finishing this up, and my parents are next, and it's, Alzheimer's is just kind of, or dementia in general, is just kind of, it just seems so daunting. It's obvious. It's so multifactorial. It's so many things, on when you start putting something together and someone comes in and says, "Hey, I think I'm slipping," or "My spouse is definitely slipping." And a lot of times that's the same conversation. How do you, obviously you just answered the question of where do you start? You start, with at the beginning. How does your approach to Alzheimer's differ, once you've kind of gotten there with the labs and the history, what's next?
Right. And, let me just say this. The interesting thing is these principles really aren't that new in the sense that, if
Yeah.
you go to the National Library of Medicine, that's PubMed online, as you probably know, just put in the search box, like, for example, studies of nutrition, diet, Alzheimer's disease. Find lots and lots of published studies. And I always say, you know, there's sort of some divide where we got these wonderful, brilliant folks and academics that do these research studies, no criticism, but where does it go from there? Why are
Yeah.
we, why are they getting all these NIH grants and they're valuable? Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying they shouldn't, but what I'm saying is there has to be some translational medicine here, that we take this information that we as Americans or worldwide are spending billions of dollars probably on, and put it
Yes.
in the clinic. Put it in the clinic. How do you implement these principles? And it's well known that not only does an anti-inflammatory type diet help to prevent cognitive decline, but it's also well known that if you take people who have mild cognitive impairment or early stage Alzheimer's disease, use the same kind of diet, that you can not only slow progression, but you can reverse cognitive decline. Exercise data is there, sleep data is there. It's just a matter of how do we get it from the theoretical and the research and put it in every clinic
Yeah.
around the country, period. That is true healthcare. That's, so what do? We work with folks. There's a lot of psychology involved because you have to be willing to change, have to be willing,
Yeah.
open the kinds of things that we're talking about doing. And then you need support. And that's why I'm a huge believer in coaching.
Yeah.
Fundamentally, it's the same thing, kinds of things that make us sick, whether we're talking about, heart disease or brain disease.
Yeah.
We have an epidemic, metabolic syndrome, hypertension, dyslipidemia, obesity, that waist to hip ratio, But look, if you go to the emergency room in your local town with a clipboard and piece of paper and a pencil, just make a hash mark every time somebody comes in with a heart attack or a stroke and say, hey, are you on medicine for diabetes? Are you medicine for high blood pressure? I mean, that's every single one of them, right? Pretty much every single one of them.
Yeah.
So that should beg the question of what exactly are we doing? I'm not saying you shouldn't treat somebody's high blood pressure if it's that high, but why does the conversation end there instead of saying, look, Clint, what I like to do is I'm really concerned you're running blood pressures like 150 over 95. It's not good for you. I'm going to get you on some medication, but I'm also going to be referring you to my dietitian. We're going to work on this, and I'm going to be tracking you very closely on this. What I want to see is in the next 6 months, a number of changes going to happen in your life. You're going to be very grateful that you did it. And frankly, you won't need that blood pressure medicine anymore, right? But that doesn't happen. And yet the
Yep.
same things that put people at risk for cardiovascular disease put people at risk for Alzheimer's disease. It's not, we're so used to giving an assign. We have to have the diagnosis so we can figure out what pill to give a person. But in reality, the
Yeah.
pill is universal. The pill is food. The pill is movement. The pill is sleep. The pill is stress resilience. And I'm not saying it fixes everything, but it sure does put a major dent in disease. Most disease is environment and lifestyle driven, not genetic, not just because it, quote, runs in your family. The reality is a lot of things that run in the family are really there because cultures, there are many cultures, right? Families eat a certain way. I learned this pattern
Yeah.
growing up. I do it because my
Yeah.
parents did it. consciously or unconsciously. I mean, you could say, well, there's Alzheimer's genes, aren't there? Well, yeah, there are Alzheimer's genes, and some are a little more hardwired than others. But we also know that you can carry that gene and never get the disease. So how do you explain that? Or
Yep.
why is it in clinical
Yep.
trials that you study a drug? If everybody was exactly the same, then you would have exactly the same outcome for every single person. But you don't. That's reality. You
Yep.
don't.
I told
So
three different people in clinic today. Sorry.
right.
Today was a long clinic day, and I saw three different people that I was explaining, yes, you have bad genetics for this or that. But have you ever heard of epigenetics? Right? Like, not every gene is turned on all the time. You're turning on different genes when you're in survival mode and you're not sleeping and you're eating whatever's in front of you just because you have to get by. And you turn on different genes when you're eating clean and exercising and sleeping and handling your stress. It's just different. And so what I like about this approach, though, and number one, it's not sexy. It doesn't make anybody any. It doesn't make drug companies any money. It doesn't. Insurance has a really hard time reimbursing for this kind of stuff. Quite frankly, lifestyle modification is more of a punchline in my classic primary care training. I was like, well, yes, they need to eat better. We never defined what better meant, but they need to eat better and exercise. Never defined what exercise meant, but they're not really going to do that. So, then we're going to give them this medicine and this medicine and this medicine. And I think what you're doing is what's beautiful about it is it gives hope. It shares hope. If you tell someone, yeah, it looks like you got early stage dementia, they're like, well, how many years do I have, doc? Because it's a death sentence. It's a quality of
Mhm.
life sentence and then a death sentence. And you're like, well, I tell you what, let's change some things. Let's put a modicum of control back on your side of this situation. And you're more than Alzheimer's. Let's see what you can do to change all of this. That's beautifully powerful. I've got a patient right now, early cognitive decline. He's aware of it. His wife's aware of it. He's got the gene, and they used to be really into eating clean and exercising, and they're not really medicine type people. But lately, life's just getting older, and he's like, yeah, we kind of for the last 9 months just been eating whatever we want, kind of been a lot of ice cream and a lot of less exercise. I mean, at least what you're doing wrong right now. Let's start working on that. But there's so much more that I mean, I would love to maybe tuck them in with you at some point here. So, man, what a sweet message to give someone, though. Hey, I'm going to hook you up with my dietitian. I'm going to hook you up with my life coach. We're going to follow you closely, and you're going to thank me for it later. And it's going to be kind of hard at first because you've been doing the wrong things for a long time. But I mean, it really is, the giving of there's two kinds of bad news in medicine, right? And you got to be good at delivering both of them. There's the bad diagnosis, but then there's the like, I got bad news. This is going to be hard, but we're going to get through it. Kind of, bad news.
Yeah. And they have to be
So
willing to do it, right? The stages of change and things like that. You have to have people that are
yeah,
open to this idea and lifestyle is a huge, huge part of it. And if folks are just going to do a sort of a self-directed approach, there's a lot that can be accomplished by, low carbohydrate. When I say low, refined carbohydrate, Mediterranean style diet, or even potentially a ketogenic diet, at least off and on, getting some exercise, make sure, and these days, most everybody has some kind of like an Apple Watch or a ring, you'd track your sleep, know what's going on, get that fixed up. Then it's the next level of take a deep dive into labs, figure out what needs to be optimized. We have, people like Andrew Huberman and other
nah,
folks out there doing podcasts that are, the hackers and the optimizers and everybody, there are lots of companies out there where you could get your labs done. I mean, it's not perfect. It's probably not for people who are really, really sick, right? Because you need a lot more direction and handholding, but nothing like prevention. So work on that stuff. Get your labs, figure out what you need, what do you need to correct, what supplements are right for you. But we love the technology, we love the magic, whatever, we just say we love the magic. So then, well, should I be doing hyperbaric oxygen? Should I be doing near infrared therapy? Should I be doing, and all those things have value for sure. They are more targeted treatments in general. So, you're not going to get any benefit out of stem cells if you don't work on the things that led to you
Yeah.
needing stem cells in the first place, but stem cells can still be valuable, right? And that's that we have to know that the other stuff is still a critical part of the equation.
No, I've got so many patients coming in these days asking about peptides because it's so hot right now. And we, of course, do peptides and prescribe them all the time because they're fun. But I'm like, no, yeah, you don't get peptides yet. You're not ready for peptides. Peptides are the icing on the cake in this situation, and your cake is a disaster. But let's start. Like, yeah, peptides sounds like a great idea here in a little while, but let's start with the basics. You're gonna get way more bang for your buck, brother. And you know, and that's someone who's been listening to a podcast who wants to optimize, who's otherwise relatively healthy. If you take someone who's got a potentially neurodegenerative, terrible diagnosis that they're scared you're going to say, yeah, you have it type, they come to you scared. And, I can only imagine that it's a bit more, it's a hard pill to swallow. At the same time, it's enough hope that I'd be willing to put in the work myself, I think. So have you found there's a subset of patients that hear this, and there's a subset of patients that just aren't ready for it? By the time they get to you, have you pre-selected kind of just by the kind of reputation you have, people that are ready to be a little outside the box?
By and large, by and large, I do see a lot of folks in my clinic, on a monthly basis, fairly traditional neurology, maybe informed by functional medicine. And some of them I can already tell
Yeah.
they're kind of got their mindset. They understand, and I'll have that discussion with them. But I would say for the vast majority of folks, this is where something comes into play, and I'll name that something. But I just want, traditional doctors don't use the word sales, right? They don't use the word marketing. But in reality, what I learned early on is, that when you don't sell people things, you exchange value, right?
Yeah.
And the that's really an important distinction. So we have to give people value. We have to, do the podcasts. We have to have the YouTube channel, the Facebook, social media is a really big platform in general for this. Send out your newsletters, have people connect with you. Say, I'm interested in Alzheimer's, I'm interested in Parkinson's. And then when you're communicating back through an email list, hopefully, you are then saying, I'm not going to send the person who's interested in Parkinson's, I'm not going to send them things about MS. I'm going to send things about Parkinson's. So you have to build that, what we call, as I'm sure you know, in the language of marketing, the know, like, trust. You have to show people that you're genuine, that you care, and then you get results for folks. And once people have been saturated enough with that, they're open to it. They want to learn. So give people learning, like give your knowledge away, teach people. They're like, this is the authority. This is the person I trust. This is who I want to see. And then they're ready to work with me because the reality is, it's kind of like January 1 and, New Year's resolutions that I have all the best of intentions, but it's really, really hard to do it on your own. And
Yeah.
then, especially when you're dealing with a diagnosis, there's also specialized knowledge. How do you integrate all of these things together? How do you create that personalized precision medicine plan that still can integrate peptides and the cool technology and all those other things, but still has to be foundational at the same time? And then how do you know when to say, you're doing a great job, Clint. You're really hitting everything. But the reality is, even with this bigger toolbox that we have to really take a deep dive with you, it's still not perfect. Following your biological markers, and what I'm seeing is a trend that I don't like, and I'm going to recommend that we layer in a medication, right? So it's
Yeah.
integrate neurology and still
I love,
track, right?
yeah, I love that. Yep. Yeah, because so many, and gosh, man, functional medicine offers so much, and there's so many men and women out there doing it so well with a chiropractic background or a naturopath background or even just a generalist background. And it still pays to be able to be the specialist in the room that knows everything about what, standard medicine, insurance based practices have to offer, as well as the functional medicine approach, and can put those together properly and help shared decision making wise help the patient decide when it's time to take the next step in which direction, because it's not without value, it's just so incomplete within the system because you can only treat the fruit, you don't really get paid to treat the root with a traditional insurance system as much as you'd like. And so the value that you add just with the combination of knowledge that you have is super powerful. And it's a nice tool to have when you have someone who's not quite ready to make all the changes, because making all the changes at once is first is impossible. And secondly, it's super daunting and people might give up before they start. But to be like along kind of like you said, here's your blood pressure medicine until you don't need it anymore while we work on all these other things. Hopefully, we'll see. We'll follow your blood pressure and find out. You can do that with Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and, MS. I've got a curveball, a little curveball throw. We'll finish with this, I think, is that so I had after COVID, I was an ER doctor during COVID by choice. I had my practice as well, but I wanted to help out. And so, I had COVID multiple times. I got the vaccine a couple times early, maybe just once, but maybe twice. Anyway, early on, just trying to do the right thing. The right thing wasn't clear at the beginning. And I was working at an ER where we got to do all of the outside the box things, and we made a big difference. It was fun. A couple years later, I get transverse myelitis. Okay,
Hmm.
interesting. That's random. Okay. I got a little Hashimoto's. Otherwise, I'm not really an autoimmune, disaster that I know of. And for the listeners, transverse myelitis is where a section of my spinal cord just sort of the insulation came off the wires for a little section across, sideways in there. Had some numbness and tingling in one leg, kind of came all the way up, but nothing else. And did the functional approach, did some gluten-free, some low-dose naltrexone, tried to really clean up the diet, did some things, saw neurology. They didn't have a lot to add other than hopefully this goes all the way away. And hopefully it's isolated. And it did go all the way away. And after a while, I just kind of went back to life as normal and chalked it up as abnormal. And a year later, I get it somewhere else. Similar symptom set. I'm like, oh no, it's back. But so, after about a week of mild symptoms, I couldn't deny it anymore. I had to tell my wife. So I went MRI'd it again, transverse myelitis in a different spot, which for the listeners is very rare. But the MRI showed really a subacute and an acute lesion. So really somehow in there, I had probably 3 strikes in a thing that's supposed to pop up once. So now I'm like, and I did MRIs of the brain too, going, all right, is this MS? What are we dealing with here? Right. Because that's the big fear. And then there's emoji and some other things that are outside, which is probably more like where I'm at. But it was like, is this, I did some spike protein cleanses and some things that it's like, is this just an autoimmune response to having a lot of COVID exposure and vaccine exposure? To the point that when I got the double hit there at the end, my doc's like, you should get on rituximab and sort of play proactive ball here on top of everything. So I've stayed gluten-free and the low dose naltrexone and all the things that I can kind of control. And then I got on this infusion medication that's twice a year that I don't have insurance because I usually just take care of things. So, they wanted to charge me $100,000 per infusion at the hospital, and I was able to get it and do it in my office with an ER doctor friend and a vial of epi next to me just in case I had anaphylaxis. And all has been well. I'm probably about to do my 3rd or 4th 6-month dose here in the office. But, and that's it so far with that and trying to do all the right things. All as well. Like, with this kind of thing, you're completely asymptomatic until you're symptomatic, until you get an episode. So what I hate about it is the decision loop. Okay, is this the right thing? Am I doing the right things? Well, I don't know. If I don't ever get it again, do I just keep doing the same thing forever? Kind of thought process. And knowing that we don't have time to go back to my birth history, and I was a vaginal delivery, and I was breastfed. If that helps. But where do you think, how, it's a loaded question. You can't answer all these questions, but you get someone like that. It's like, well, that's weird. And thank goodness I haven't had any more episodes, and thank goodness and thank God that I don't
Right.
didn't have any never had any brain lesions, and maybe I don't have MS, right? But kind of in the context of everything we talked about, are there take home points that you would give a patient like me in a situation like this? I didn't catch you with a curveball right at the end.
Right. Well, sure. And of course, I'm wearing my doctor hat now, so I'd wonder.
Yeah.
Hopefully, I'm sure you check. And by the way, if this could get a little complicated on the podcast, but there's some antibodies I'd like to know whether they were checked.
Uh-huh. They,
Aquaporin 4 and one called MOG antibody. This is related
yeah.
to a disease that is very similar to MS in some ways, but it's called neuromyelitis optica. So I'd want to know, was there any evidence either by MRI of the optic, because you can get close up views of the
Yeah.
optic nerves, or do what's called a visual evoked potential, any evidence of demyelination of the optic, one or both optic nerves as well. And certainly rituximab from a conventional perspective would be a very good treatment for that. But then the other piece of it that I love, and it's really again very much part of what I call first century medicine, is biological markers that not only are helpful on the diagnosis side, but are very
Hmm.
helpful on these tracking side.
Ooh. Yeah.
Have we shut this down? And quite honest, and then are you in remission? Right? How long do you need to be utilizing rituximab before you say, you know what, Clint? Because for folks listening or watching this, as you said, but I just want to reinforce it, that this is an infusion of, it's an biological therapy. First of all, it's not a drug in the traditional sense. It's an antibody. These antibodies are targeting what are called CD20 positive B cells. These are the ones that are aggressively reactive, in this case, targeting the nerve cells in the spinal cord. And it just eliminates it, literally sort of like blows up this particular subset of B cells, right?
Yeah.
But what happens is after
Yeah.
6 months, by 6 months, you're starting to regenerate those B cells, so you infuse again. But the actual antibodies that are involved, and for those who know MS, this is really the we have drugs called a few drugs, one called ocrelizumab or Ocrevus. Then we have ofatumumab or Kesimpta. There's also ubrelizumab. These are all really iterations of the same drug, rituximab, just more humanized antibodies. So they would all work. They're all really more or less the same drug. But the point is that with most of them, with the exception being ofatumumab, they are an every 6 month infusion. The antibodies do their job within the first 6 weeks or so, and then they're actually out of your system. And what's
Yeah.
the therapeutic aspect is just the fact that you don't have all these autoreactive B cells around to do the damage. Point being that we should be able to then also track disease activity and say, hey, you're close to that 6 month mark. What's going on? Do you still have a lot of, do you have high levels of inflammatory and neurodegenerative markers? If you say yes, we treat. If you say no, say, well, Clint,
Ooh.
you've been really stable for several years. Let's go 8 months. Let's see what happens. Let's repeat the test. Let's not treat you right now. Let's give it a couple, 3 more months. Let's retest. What are your biomarkers now? Well, they're still low, still the same, unchanged. Well, how would you feel about going another 3 months? We'll retest, right? At a certain point, you say, guess what? I bet you're in remission. Let's move this test out to maybe once every 6 months instead of once every three, once every 12, right? Eventually say, guess what? This is behind you now. So that's essentially conventional medicine. But the problem is that too often these technologies, which are widely available, commercially available, covered by insurance, they're not being used in the clinic. But that would be an all functional medicine side. That would definitely be a way to start to get a handle on the problem. We could, of course,
Right.
bring in all those functional medicine principles. Let's take a deep dive. Let's look at your nutrients. Let's look at oxidative stress, inflammatory drivers, dyslipidemia,
Yep.
metabolic markers, hormones,
Yeah.
toxins. All of those things have to be evaluated. You got to figure out what's covered, what's optimal, what's out of range, suboptimal, deficient, toxic level. Get all those things corrected. Then we have another layer of reassurance that we're covering our bases. And
Yeah.
yes, with the help of rituximab, hopefully you will go into remission and we can confidently track this in a
Yeah.
way that does not put you at risk. If I say, well, Clint, don't change anything, just stop the drug. Isn't that the
No.
definition of insanity? Right.
Yeah. No.
So that's how I would see it.
Stakes are too high. And it's ultimately an autoimmune condition. So all of the functional medicine strategies to decrease inflammation and, autosensitivity they all
Mhm.
apply. And I
Yep.
have Hashimoto's for sure. Of course, sort of like 40% of people that I see, but that's at least one you know, sensitivity. And we don't want to drag this whole thing on all the way, but I think it brings back to the point that my best shot at getting off this IV that doesn't have that, it's pretty, I've had very low side effect potential with it, unless of course I get, some sort of white blood cell cancer or something down the line because I've been screwing with my cells. I mean, it's not unheard of. So the idea is that there's a risk reward to taking it. There's a risk reward to not taking it. And if I can control the variables with as much as possible with a functional medicine lifestyle type, um, um, you know, obviously you're just going to be healthier for doing them, then that's exactly where I want to be. And that's kind of the same
Yeah.
way that our patients want with whatever condition. It just so happens that this one's kind of a in your wheelhouse, and I love to get in your opinion. I would probably would like to know which markers you would recommend I check every once in a while.
Well, we can talk about that. And
Probably have you
folks
email that
listening,
later.
all of this is based on something called systems biology. It's really, in the framework of functional medicine, there are, about different things in these systems that we talk about. Essentially, your immune system, your mitochondria, your whole system of assimilating, bringing nutrients into your body and breaking them down, digesting them, assimilating them into who you are, food we are truly what we eat, and then of course eliminating them. So there's kind of the focus on we call biotransformation and elimination, that both the exposure to toxins and then how do we detoxify, how does the body naturally handle metabolic waste or actually environmental toxin exposure. There's, we have to understand vascular disease, what they call transport in functional medicine. We have to understand hormones, and I often hear people who've been exposed to functional medicine say, well, I start with the mitochondria, then I treat the gut, then I
Yeah.
address the hormones.
Yeah.
And that's okay. But the problem is everything is connected, first of all, right? These systems don't operate like in traditional medicine, where if you're a cardiologist, you're the heart. If you're a neurologist, you're the
Yeah.
brain. If you're a GI doctor, it's the gut. That's not how functional medicine works. Secondly, if I said, okay, here are those systems. Now, what I want you to do as an intellectual exercise is let's talk about food. And then I want you to tell me how food affects the assimilation system, how food affects your mitochondria, how food affects your biotransformation elimination, your hormones, your transport system. How does food go all the way around what they call the functional medicine matrix? And not surprisingly, food or nutrition affects every single one of these systems.
Yep.
Sleep affects every single one of these systems, right? Movement affects every single one of these systems. A drug is like a targeted missile, right?
Yeah.
It's meant to hit one thing, which could be very powerful. And certainly drug companies look for those pivot points where if we disrupt it here, then everything else, then we stop the whole process. We're slow the whole process. But we still have to be, you talk about peptides, and I do use the like GLP-1s in my practice, but I'm not a big peptide guy. but peptides are drugs for the most part. And, there's peptides that modulate growth hormone. There's peptides
Yep.
that, you know, specifically target mitochondria in a certain way. And so that's, we can call it what we want, but they're still drugs. They're still drugs. They may be the secret of the functional medicine doctor that, you can go down the road to the conventional clinic. They're not using the peptides that you and I are talking about. They might be using Ozempic, but we have to be careful because if you're going to use that kind of therapy, and folks have to understand what is the research behind them, what do they actually do, what do we understand about their safety, how well have they been studied? I think you have to ask those questions. What does the FDA say about them? You should at least be informed about that. Then you have to decide, okay, this is the fine paintbrush for the big canvas. It's not going
Yeah.
to, it's not big,
Nope.
thick swaths going across.
Yep.
We just need to
No.
fix one thing, right? And then you still have to work on the other stuff.
Yeah. I tell my patients all the time, like peptides, you know, your DNA makes RNA, which makes a protein, which does something. And someone has decided, I want more of that. I want more of that result. So I want more of that protein. Okay, here you go. It's basically something your body makes anyway, or as close to it as we can do. And let's do that one thing. Right. But what we're talking about is, the pillars of functional medicine and health and wellness of movement and diet and stress and sleep and, toxin burden and all those things. It's like, no, that's every system. I don't do peptides for people that need help in all those other areas. And so I know we got to wrap this up, Ken. Thank you so much for coming on and for what you do and just for the hope that you give people in a situation that feels otherwise hopeless, man. I mean, that's the reality is you're bringing in a modicum of control in a powerless, hopeless, otherwise powerless, hopeless situation. So thanks for your time, man. I appreciate your advice for little old me as well. That was fun. Sorry for putting that curveball on you at the end, but I knew you could handle it.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks a lot.
All right, man. We'll talk again soon. Thanks for coming on. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining me today on MyMD Unscripted. I hope today's conversation opened your mind and inspired you to imagine a better path for your health and therefore life. If you found value in this episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone passionate about transforming healthcare. Real change starts with real conversations, so let's keep them going. Until next time, stay well, stay curious, and never stop pushing for better.